Hello, everyone. Welcome to Critical Faculty. I'm your host, Hanney Seylim. Today, we are going to continue the series on French characters around the Bible, characters that have influenced the proceedings of the gospel in terms of its beginnings and its end. Today we want to talk about a couple of characters that are sort of not quite clear whether they are that influential, whether they are even historical characters, namely John the Baptist and Joseph of Arimathea. I couldn't think of anybody who's more colorful in terms of the amount of information we're going to be listening to now, other than the fantastic Dr. Robert Price. Dr. Robert Price, welcome to Critical Faculty.
Well, it's great to be back.
Great to have you again. I really missed our chats.
Yeah, me too.
Right, let's get into it. I mean, couple of characters, quite colorful in terms of at least John the Baptist. He is such a revered person that he is held as in some faith as the lost and the greatest prophet who's ever lived. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you know about John the Baptist?
Yeah, one thing I think is very important that becomes evident very clearly in an early Christian novel called The Clementine Recognitions, or The Clementine Homilies. It exists in two slightly different versions. There's a lot of stuff going on in it, but there's one scene in particular where in the temple, the Sanhedrin has organized a debate between Jewish factions. And there's, I don't know, I forget who a couple of them were, but the Christians were there and the John the Baptist sect was there, and they were not allies. In fact, the John the Baptist group is trying to prove that Christians are wrong and that Jesus wasn't the Messiah, but that John the Baptist was. And they said, look, in your own book, it says, it has Jesus saying, among men born of women, none has ever appeared who is greater than John the Baptist. Well, that kind of means Jesus is a subordinate to him, doesn't it? And of course, you could say that, well, yes, but if you read the whole passage, Jesus then says, and yet the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. Well, I just would bet that is an attempt to mitigate the plain implication, which the John the Baptist sect saw in the original, that it's a way of saying whatever it means. It's a way of saying, now Jesus wasn't including himself or any Christian. I mean, even the least Christian is greater than John, as great as John was. Don't want to say anything against him, but even he, he pales in comparison to Joe Christian over here. That has to be an attempt at a lame attempt at a rejoinder. Well, that was one of them, and they pointed to another one. Yeah, where who baptized whom? It seems like Jesus goes to an evangelistic rally led by John, and he comes forward to confess his sins for forgiveness. Now, come on. Who is ministering to whom? And of course Matthew is really worried about that, right? He has a similar weird evasion where Jesus is next in line. John recognizes him, which he doesn't in Luke and Mark. But he says, wait a minute, or as I like to say, what's a nice savior like you doing in a place like this? Why are you coming to me to be baptized? I mean, if anything, I need to be baptized by you. And Jesus says, yeah, I know what you're saying, but let's go through with it anyway. To fulfill all righteousness, to do all the righteous things.
Yeah.
Example to others, it doesn't really say. In fact, it's not what it means. It's trying to say what it doesn't mean. That, oh, no, if you think this means John was greater than Jesus, no, that's wrong. And here's the whole story to prove it. And there were other things, like Jesus doesn't even get baptized in the Gospel of John.
Yes, I was about to mention that, because John doesn't even mention John the Baptist. He talks about almost the incident, because I think it's a different language. It's high Christology rather than a historical narration of events. He mentions the incident, but doesn't mention the name of John the Baptist, because he wants only Jesus to be in focus and maybe himself as a second supporting act.
Well, yeah, he has John and Jesus present on the same scene when John is baptizing, but he doesn't say John baptized him. And when a couple of John's disciples see Jesus coming, they don't know who he is, but John says, hey, look there, that guy is the elect of God, or the Lamb of God. And they leave and follow Jesus and say, where are you staying? And he says, you come and see, you can be my disciples. And they are. And of course, that is really a fictional development for the sake of the reader. If you're a John the Baptist fan, maybe you want to jump ship like these guys who were disciples of John did. But then when John speaks to the crowd, it isn't even about being baptized. He said, this is why I came on the scene, to promote him, to announce him. I was told that when you see the Spirit descend and remain on a man, that'll be the one. And I have seen it. Well, when did he see it? It doesn't say anything about any connection with Jesus being baptized, and that can't be an oversight, because, he's trying to avoid that embarrassment. In the Gospel of the Ebionites, which didn't make it into the canon, there's this great little incident where Mary says to her family, I see that John the Baptist is baptizing for the remission of sins. Well, let's pack up and go. And Jesus says, why should I go? Are you inferring that I've sinned? There's another one where he says, that's not what you think, folks. And so the Baptists, we know from this other document, were debating the Christians. And in fact, the Baptist sect never died out. It still exists today as the Mandean religion, which means the Gnostics. They're Iraqi and I guess also some of them in Iran, Lebanon, and Israel. They claim that they're the sect that was founded by John. Now, this is a long time ago, and some scholars don't buy it, but I don't see any reason.
That's what they're called, the Mandeism. The Mandeism, yeah. A very interesting sect. It's got even the Druze in Lebanon, and some Baha'i faith as well. He's such an interesting character. He's known by the prophet Yahya. Yahya is it's his name. So apart from obviously at that point of meeting Jesus, and he's got now his own group, and I think the sect that John the Baptist belonged to is the Essenic. I think is Essenes.
He
Um,
might have. He's described in terms that strongly remind us of what Pliny the Elder, Josephus, and Philo said. They all described the Essenes, and they lived in the Judean desert. They were ascetics. They were communal. They were vegetarians, ate locusts and wild honey, were baptized daily, and so it sounds so much like John the Baptist that for a long time people have said, well, I bet you he was an Essene, and he might have been. It's just that it's one of these embarrassment of riches things where there were all kinds of ascetics and weirdos and so forth.
yeah.
But he does sort of sound like him, and so what I'm getting at is that I'm leading to the fact that even in the Gospels, there is an attempt to co-opt the John sect and to get them to join up. There were early Christians that thought John the Baptist was a false prophet, but in the New Testament, Christians know. Like it appears that the prologue to the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word, etc., etc. It looks like that was originally about John the Baptist as the light of the world, and the one who wrote it wrote the Gospel of John Bultmann suggested, had been a member of the John the Baptist Gnostic sect, but joined Christianity and brought some of the traditions and texts with him and retooled them so that there's a definite poetic structure to the prologue, but suddenly it gets interrupted when it says, there came a man whose name was John to bear witness to the light. He wasn't that light, but came to bear witness to the light. And then it goes on in poetry again. It just seems like a kind of an unassimilated block stuck into the text to say that, John was great, but he was really just the forward man for Jesus, preparing the way, etc.
Yeah, that's why he's also known as John the Forerunner. One of his names. Yeah,
there's when later on in chapter 3, I believe, after the Nicodemus scene, they remark that John was still baptizing, and so was Jesus, a very different idea than we get from the other Gospels, but that Jesus was winning more converts, and one of John's disciples is worried about this. He says, Master, they're beating us out there. And he says, look, you think I'm worried about that? I'm like the best man at the wedding. I'm announcing the bridegroom. I'm not the bridegroom. He must increase and I must decrease. I've done my job. Well, that sounds again like you John the Baptist folks. Don't overestimate the importance of John. He did his thing and he's Saint John, but he's not the Messiah. Let's get that straight. As in the life of Brian, there's a mess in here, but not a Messiah. So there's one, and so forth. So there's this thing that we want to co-opt him. We like him too, but he's number 2 on the totem pole. Then in Luke, you got the same thing. It's based on Mark, of course, so it seems. And it's interesting that in Mark, John the Baptist says, I baptize you with water, but one is coming who will baptize you in the Spirit. He is the mightier one. I'm not worthy to tie this guy's shoes. Well, does he mean God is coming? I mean, some thought there wouldn't be a Messiah. There would simply be God kicking butt in the end times. Well, in Luke, the same line is quoted, but Luke introduces it differently. He said, some there thought, gee, I wonder if John might be the Messiah. And then we have this quote that I just quoted. In other words, Luke has made it into an answer to this question as if it had been posed to him directly. No, not me. There's someone much mightier and all that. Why is that? Because he's anticipating what the readers might think. John is the Messiah. Oh no. In Mark, we read that when Jesus and his disciples were not fasting, this disturbed other pious Jews, and so somebody approached him and said, well, this is odd. The Pharisees fast and John the Baptist's disciples fast, but you're not fasting. Why is that? And then he explains and so on, the cloth and the wineskin and so on and so forth. Wait a minute. We think of John the Baptist publicly endorsing Jesus. Here's the guy I've been waiting for. That's incompatible with him continuing to have a sect with its own special prayer or the custom of fasting. And so did John ever endorse Jesus? It seems not. In Luke, the way he introduces the Lord's Prayer, it's just part of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. But in Luke, the disciples see Jesus praying, and when he's done, they say, Lord, teach us to pray as John the Baptist taught his disciples. Well, of course, they knew what prayer was. They must have been praying all their lives. They mean they have a special prayer. We would like a distinctive, Jesus prayer. What about it? And that's why he introduces the Lord's Prayer in Luke. Again, why would that be? Why would John continue with a sect that was ascetic, for one thing, right? Remember the thing where John the Baptist came neither eating nor drinking. You say, look at this, the guy's a demoniac. But the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you say, what? Look at this glutton, this drunkard. And so, well, which way do you want it? Well, that tells you that they weren't doing the same stuff. And they can live and let live, apparently. And maybe it comes to a head in Luke's infancy narrative where we suddenly learn that John the Baptist is Jesus' cousin.
Yes,
and flipped over in the womb to bow down to the fetus Jesus. I mean, come on. How much clearer could it be? They're trying to say, look, we've got room for John in our pantheon, but he's not the Messiah. What do you say? You're shrinking. We're growing. Why don't you jump ship and come over? And some did. So it seems, as Strauss pointed out long ago, if there was a Jesus and a John the Baptist, they probably never met. So that's an important thing about John.
There's no biblical story is complete until you go to the backstory, and the backstory happens with. Looks like Isaiah has got a prophecy for everything, including the birth of John the Baptist. Was John the Baptist? I mean, I think his father was Zechariah. Was there any prophecies about his birth?
Well, yeah, and one is pretty weird because when Zechariah breaks into, I feel a song coming on, and he starts saying that his son to be born will be from the house of David. What? You're talking about Jesus, not John. What's happened? There's some kind of funny business has happened, and the whole nativity of John, which parallels that of Jesus and of Samuel in the Old Testament. Both New Testament ones are copies of that, so the idea that they were sort of forced in to a fictional relationship, I think provides one of the ways of understanding James the Just being the brother of the Lord in Galatians, that there's a lot of things that could mean, but if they are saying he was the actual sibling of Jesus, to me, that is exactly like saying John the Baptist was Jesus' cousin. You're just sort of grafting him onto the genealogy as they used to do in the Old Testament. How are we going to get those 12 tribes together? Well, let's posit that they were all descended from the 12 sons of one guy. And that was the way of becoming blood brothers when the sects, or in that case, the tribes merged. That seems to me a neglected possibility there. But who was John the Baptist? It's difficult to say. I will finish on him by saying I just love the depiction of John the Baptist, played by Andre Gregory, the great director, in The Last Temptation of Christ.
Yes, great.
Oh man, it's like his disciples are all like Hare Krishnas and so on. That has to be right. I mean, we think of the early Christians as the folks down at First Presbyterian or something. No chance. So what a fascinating character.
Because John the Baptist was pretty much his ministry was about the preparation of the kingdom of God. He's awaiting the Messiah. Everything that he does is a Messiah-oriented type of activity, albeit a little bit more devoted in a slightly spiritual way. But do we have any demarcations or any notes on that he was expecting the Messiah that all the Jews were expecting, the kind of warlord, king, victorious, strong man who is going to rid the Jews from their occupants and free the lands? Or was he expecting just the right Messiah who is not going to be using the sword, but rather mere words to get people to the kingdom of heaven?
Well, he must have, if the Gospels are telling us anything historically, and you never know where to draw the line, he is certainly depicted as expecting an apocalyptic cataclysm, that when the coming one arrives, that he will baptize with spirit and fire. He will prune the branches and throw the fruitful ones into the fire. He will sift the population like grain, and the chaff will be burnt up in unquenchable fire. So he might not have been a sword. He might not have expected a sword-bearing military Messiah, but if there's anything to what it says, he certainly did expect the big blow up. Now, if he was a member of the Qumran community, who we think were Essenes, he could have believed both, because they believed that they used the same terminology. The spirit and fire will consume the bad guys and all that. And we will take up the sword and go on our war horses to join the battle against the Kittim, the word for the old Philistines and so on, but they reapplied it to the Romans. So they figured that they wouldn't be on their own. They would be fighting shoulder to shoulder with the angels against Rome. So if he was one of them, he would have expected to take part in a revolutionary war.
Yeah, it seems that John the Baptist was quite influential to the point that we talked about Mandaism. That's a faith that is still around, practicing very, very similar rituals. These are kind of sort of nomadic, kind of a hippie type of life. They're quite loose about their beliefs. It's quite spiritual. Even in Baha'i, it's a very interesting new religion that's emerged a couple of centuries ago that observes every other religion, saying that the God reveals himself in every single way. Everyone is a prophet, including Eastern religions, Buddha, everyone. So it's very difficult to falsify when you accept everyone.
Yeah,
very generous. But it seems to be like he's a patron saint of the of the desert dwellers, those who would. It's almost like the transition between paganism and monotheism in a very strange concoction. How do you see this kind of faith? How is it distinct to you, or is it just very, very loose?
Well, they do have defined doctrines, and they, as you say, with monotheism, this is a perennial question. They have some of the biblical patriarchs as deified archangelic figures who are saviors, like Enosh, who in some traditions was the first man. His name means man. It's like Bar Enosh, the son of man. He is called Enosh Uthras, which means glorious Enosh. And there is another one, Sithil, who is Seth El, meaning Seth is a god. Just like the Qumran folks and others thought Enoch had been transfigured into a fiery angel with hundreds of wings and so on, and that he sat at the right hand of God and was called the Lesser Yahweh. Holy mackerel. So they, or there was the Mandeans had Manda Dahai, that is the knowledge of L'chaim, life. And I believe he's the one that they believe was incarnated as John the Baptist. So John was not merely a prophet for them. And they pointedly say Jesus was a false Messiah. Just like we hear in the Clementines with that debate with the John the Baptist sect, and they're still around. They live in the marshlands of Iraq. They seem to have relocated there in a time of persecution. So for all I know, they might have been desert dwellers originally. But they're a really fascinating group. They're a sect that became an ethnic group because they're isolated basically, and they're big enough that they can intermarry without serious genetic problems apparently, and they're really fascinating, like a living museum relic, and I hope they can stay around because they're really important. I have in my book Houses of the Holy, I deal with 12 religions. The Mandeans are one of them, the Baha'is are another, and the Yazidis, yet another one that are sort of in the same orbit. Just really fascinating. And most people have never had occasion to hear of them.
Yeah. Again, in the book of Isaiah, again, so many prophecies there. There was one reference, and I can't really remember the exact words, but there was a reference that God is talking, I'm sending a messenger before you to make the way, to prepare. Is that reference to John the Baptist?
Well, that's originally from Exodus, where God says to Moses, I will send a messenger before you. And Moses says, no, it's got to be you, not just some angel. And he said, well, okay, I will reside in the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant, and therefore I will actually be with you. But that's what that's originally about. But this thing about a voice crying in the wilderness makes great. Yeah. That is from Isaiah. And that was originally about the returning exiles from Babylon to Judah, and that the voice crying in the wilderness probably was the so-called second Isaiah, who wrote that section of the book. But in fact, Mark merges parts of both passages together and just attributes the whole thing to Isaiah. They didn't have the same standards of accuracy we do in the treatment. Yeah.
According to historical, John the Baptist gets eventually beheaded and killed. Was he around long enough while Jesus in ministry, or was he killed just sort of around the beginning of Jesus? Because I think it was the year 30, was it?
That's difficult to say because Josephus associates him with Aretas the Fourth, the king of Nabatea, which was like a Romanized Arab kingdom. Petra, the sandstone ruins or whatever, that was their capital. And Herod Antipas had made a marriage alliance with Nabatea by marrying the daughter of Aretas the Fourth. But then he decided he'd rather be married to Herodias, the wife of his brother, also named Herod. He wasn't Herod Antipas, but he was another Herod. And so he sent his first wife packing. And this was it's just the opposite of a marriage alliance. I mean, it's like a declaration of war by divorcing the guy's daughter. And so it was thought that, Aretas then attacked the forces of Herod Antipas to punish him. And I think he beat him. And Josephus says that Jews who remained big fans of John said, well, what do you expect? He was, just as John was rebuking him for having pulled this stunt, God has punished him by this defeat. Well, some scholars have said, wait a second. This implies, I mean, we know when Aretas the Fourth lived, and it implies that John the Baptist was killed in something like 39 CE or AD, which is years after Jesus is supposed to have died. So it really makes you wonder if it shows the artificiality of linking the two as contemporaries. They, unless there's some other solution to that seeming contradiction, I would say that kind of shows they really had nothing to do with each other. Plus, Jesus refers to John as a figure of the past. So they couldn't keep this straight, apparently. He says, from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of God suffers violence, and violent men take it by force. What do you mean, last week? No, from the days of John the Baptist implies an earlier time. So what's the deal here? It's difficult to be sure who lived when or if.
Incredible. Is there any extra biblical sources other than Josephus that mention John the Baptist at all?
I don't think so, though. There is the Slavonic Josephus, which is supposed to be a translation into Old Russian or Slavonic of an Aramaic edition of Josephus. Josephus kept expanding his works, and so they were published different times in different editions. And in the Wars of the Jews, in the Slavonic version, it has something that sounds like the brief paragraph in Antiquities of the Jews, which talks about Jesus, the disciples, Pilate, and so on. And in this version, we hear a lot more about both Jesus, who appears to be a ringleader of revolution, and John the Baptist, who lived before him and was also some kind of ringleader. And Robert Eisler talks about this in his great neglected book, The Messiah, Jesus, and John the Baptist. And he says that even in Luke, where alone among the Gospels, John gives special instructions to tax gatherers and soldiers and so on. They're repenting, and they say, well, what do we do, Master? Well, when he speaks to the soldiers, Eisler points out it doesn't actually say soldiers. The word stratiotes or something means those who are going off to war. Like that's why they want his instructions. And he says, don't extort money by leaning on these people you're supposed to be fighting for and all that. And he makes, I think, a very suggestive case for John as older and more controversial figure. So we don't really know what's going on, but in the different versions of Josephus, we have these odd puzzle pieces about John the Baptist. Other than that, I think we have to wait till we get to medieval Muslim scholars who think they know things about him.
I want at some point to speak about Josephus. Josephus is considered to be an extra biblical source of some sort. I've got my doubts. I think Josephus would be quite an interesting character to speak about because I want to know his background and I want to know what happened to him and whether he was motivated in any shape or form to write what he wrote. But that's a different type of conversation. Luke doesn't mention the dancing before the beheading episode. There was a very famous dance that leads to the beheading of John the Baptist, but I don't think Luke mentions that.
Gee, I don't remember. I kind of assumed he did, but I don't know. Come to think of it,
Yeah,
you and Mark have it.
yeah, but that's hardly a contradiction. I guess the Gospels we know by now they've got different focal points and angles, so they can always argue. Now that's not what was in focus, and they were focusing on some other narrative. But John the Baptist himself used to accept sinners and baptized tax collectors and soldiers, and so he was perceived during his time, and that's why maybe people looked up to him and say, "Is he the Messiah?" He's actually almost like helping people with their sins and cleansing them in the river of Jordan. Was it the reason why people started to think, oh, hold on a second, this could be the Messiah we're all waiting for?
Well, since he was a charismatic leader and a pious man, that would be only natural, even if he never claimed it, because you can look at the parallel with Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who a dozen or more years ago, no, more than that, 20-something years ago, he was a very charismatic Hasidic Rebbe, and he said we've got to get secular and backslidden Jews to renew their faith, so we can get ready for the coming of Mashiach, the Messiah. And he never intimated that he might be the Messiah, but his followers thought he's got to be the Messiah. He's not saying it, but who else could it be? And then when he died, some expected him to rise from the dead and return as the Messiah, which is exactly what Bultmann thought about Jesus, by the way, that he didn't teach that he was the Messiah, but people couldn't help thinking he was. And when, after he died, people had visions of him, they said, okay, that's all the proof I need. Jesus will return as the Messiah. Same thing. And I kind of doubt the Hasidic Jews are reading Bultmann to borrow this. But the psychology would be only natural. And also think of one of the options when it says that people had different ideas about Jesus. Who do men say that I am? Some say the returned Elijah. Some say John the Baptist raised from the dead. And some say one of the other prophets. And Herod then repeats the same options. Later, he hears about Jesus and says, they say this, that, and the other thing, but I bet it's John. I beheaded him, but maybe he's raised from the dead, and that is why these powers are at work in him. Dunamis, power, miracle. That's very much like the statement in Romans chapter 1. According to the flesh, descended from David, but by the Spirit designated through the resurrection as the Son of God. That wording sounds so similar. I suspect that they concluded that John was the Messiah because this was the resurrection kerygma. He is risen and must have been declared as the Messiah. So even if he never said it, it's easy to see. Like it was a case of mistaken identity, right? They heard about Jesus and said, I bet this was John the Baptist. And I mean, how many of them ever had the opportunity to see Jesus up close, or John either? Well, I guess they got a glimpse of him as they were being dunked. But, how many would be in a position to say whether it was, people saw Elvis after his death in line at the Burger King. Well, of course, they were hallucinating or whatever, but at least you would know what Elvis looked like because of television and these terrible movies he was in. But with Jesus, how many people, he comes into Jerusalem on the triumphal entry, and they say, who is this guy? They said, don't you know this is the prophet Jesus from Galilee? Well, they didn't know. How would they know? Same thing here. Easy to mistake identities.
Interesting. Was there any reference that John the Baptist had any like a miraculous birth or performed miracles at any point?
Well, in Luke, it's just like Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac, that she is way too old to be having kids, but she has Isaac nonetheless miraculously. And Paul, in fact, parallels that with Jesus rising from the dead. He says that, well, that's impossible too if you want to use Bayes' theorem there. But nonetheless, it happened, and Abraham believed it would, despite it was being against all odds. Same with Jesus rising from the dead. But the real parallel is with John the Baptist, because Elizabeth was just way too old to have kids, but she did. And the thing with John kicking in the womb to acknowledge his messianic fetus cousin, that's kind of a legendary miracle story attached to the birth of both of them. And so there is a parallel, and the fact that both are paralleled with Samuel's youth and all that, because there's not that much difference between a virginal conception and another kind of miraculous conception.
Yeah.
So
yeah, we all know about the myth of the Dan Brown Da Vinci Code, the bloodline, or the Sangre Royale, the royal blood of Jesus, after he fled to France with Mary Magdalene and had offspring, allegedly, and they're trying to protect that particular sacred family that still live among us. I think Tom Hanks realizes at the very end that he's actually the very girl that he's enchanted with is could be an offspring of Jesus Christ. Was the bloodline of John the Baptist, has it sort of yielded any significant figures later on?
Well, they never say whether John was married. It sort of implies that he wasn't, as a hermit in the wilderness. Of course, it's possible he was married and had children before that. We're not really told anything about his life. And the same is true of Jesus. There's another book out. There was one in the early 70s by Walter or somebody, Phipps, Was Jesus Married? I think the new one has the same title, but a different author. And they make a kind of a circumstantial case. Well, Jesus was considered a rabbi, and the rabbis were all married, so he must have been married too, which proves nothing. But it isn't impossible. It just doesn't say. Was Paul married? Same thing. I mean, he says, I can wish that everybody was like me. And he apparently means celibate. He says, I have the right to take a wife around with me like the other disciples, but I don't. Did he leave his wife? Who knows? It doesn't really say, but there's no particular reason to think so. And however, the Da Vinci Code thing, that really was frustrating to me to read it, because the whole premise of the book is that if Jesus married and had children, that would show he wasn't just a ghost, I guess, that he was human. I got news for you, Dan. The Orthodox Christian view is that he was fully human as well as divine. He
Sure.
was a ghost and so on. And so there is nothing heretical about saying Jesus could have had children. Now, it would raise interesting angels on the head of a pin type questions. Well, if he had a kid, would the kid have would he be a demigod?
Yeah.
Well, that would be interesting, but that doesn't mean it couldn't be true. It's just that there's no reason to think it's true. But if
Yeah.
it were, who the heck cares?
Yeah, and it will not be sort of the first time a god that descended from heaven to have sex with, this story is as old as the even before the ancient Greeks. So nothing new here. It's just a slightly different form. But it would make quite interesting, because with the grandchildren of Jesus would display some sort of divinity at some point, and that's what Tom Hanks was interested in the movie, to see if there is actually something will occur being a descendant of Jesus, but there wasn't. The lady who was supposed to be a descendant of Jesus was just a normal person. She was even surprised that she was, which begs the question: is the whole thing imagined? And he's just a man who. And this is something that I was going to propose to you. It seems that nobody wants to claim anything in the antiquity. It's a horrible thing to say you're a prophet or you're a god or you have to be dubbed by the people. You can't call yourself anything. People will have to point at you and say, "I think you are that person. I think you are the Messiah. I think you are that prophet." Even if they might have claimed it at some point, but when they wrote about them, they never claimed directly to be anybody. Rather, it's just the people. It looks like it gains more legitimacy that way. It's like even Jesus many times said it. Like, "Oh, I haven't said anything. You said it. You say so." Putting it back on the people, and that somehow gives the narrative a lot more legitimacy. Because I can't be fraud because I'm not claiming anything.
Yeah, like in the life of Brian, only the true Messiah denies his divinity. Also, there was an interview with Sun Myung Moon, and they said, "Are you the Messiah?" And he said, "Well, I would have to answer that the way Jesus did." What a brilliant, evasive answer. Why would you have to answer it the way Jesus, the Messiah, answered it? And because by drawing the parallel, aren't you admitting you are the Messiah? No, I'm not saying. Brilliant.
It's genius in a way. It's such a. I mean, I love reading the Bible for the right reasons, because it's such a narrative that anybody could read whatever they want the hell they read about the text, and it's genius, because in a movie, or you're writing a script of a movie, you'd want people to argue about a scene. It's not real clear cut, and people will see it in so many different angles, and that will actually contribute to success of a lot of movies, because you'll see it from the angle that talks to your narratives within. You want to see a bit of cheekiness, it's there. You want to see a bit of piety, it's there. You want to see a little bit of everything, and it's fantastic. But a lot of atheists don't like the Bible so much. As soon as they hear the Bible, they go straight away to the fact, oh, it's not real, and therefore I must hate it. But I think it carries a lot of interesting human concepts.
Mm-hmm. I think Tillich said the Bible is the greatest book because it's the most human of books.
Oh, great. I agree. I completely agree. That's why I gave rise to Superman. Who else? I
Mhm,
mean, we talk the Green Mile. You know, the
mhm,
that big black giant who's
mhm.
actually another version of Jesus.
Yeah, yeah.
There's so many different Jesuses among us. You know, there's
Mhm.
still, and you can see it's an archetype. It's the savior. It's the
Mhm.
savior in every civilization, in every culture. It's fascinating. I think the Man of Steel. I remember he was descending from the sky, Superman, and the way they were showing people how they were reaching out to him,
Mhm.
and he's coming from on the clouds, almost like
Yeah,
it's. I mean, this is Jesus all over.
yeah, yeah. And when he's in there talking to this priest about should I give myself up to General Zod or not, you can see right behind him the stained glass window of Jesus praying in Gethsemane. Oh, boy.
Oh, it's yeah. A lot of people don't even know. Like when you talk about Superman being Jesus,
Mm.
they go, "What the hell are you talking about?" Like they can't even see the narrative.
Oh,
But yeah, for the untrained eyes.
mm.
All right. Well, looks like John the Baptist is going to remain an elusive character, and he's a lot of cults are still following his footsteps in so many different ways. But let's go to another interesting character in the Bible, and namely Joseph of Arimathea. When we talked about surnames before in different episodes, we talked about surnames being usually either a place, it could be an attribute the person is renowned for, or a job. Is Arimathea rather a place?
Well, it seems to be, and there is a known village that sort of sounds like that, but others say it's not close enough. We don't really know if there was an Arimathea. Richard Carrier came up with the interesting suggestion that it's an artificial name that really characterizes him as the character he is. He would be one of uh, Svetan Todorov's narrative men. This literary critic said there are characters that are nothing but their function in the story. Like he mentioned one where there's this quack doctor who is called Dr. Kilgrave. And it's obviously a wink to the reader, but that's all the guy is there for, to goof up somebody's
Do you
dialogue.
think it, do you think it justifies quite an elaborate tomb? That tomb that has a sort of a stone that sort of gets moved and reveals the fantastic scene. Because other than a rich man donating that for particular burial, it would have not been possible for Jesus.
Yeah, I just the one thing about the place name, it's possible it is simply that Carrier came up with this idea that you're really supposed to break it down. It's kind of allegorical almost. Ari, Greek prefix meaning the best, like aristocrat and so on, and mathetes, disciple. Could it be that Matthew is saying this guy is Joseph, the best disciple? Because look, he's the one that gets custody of the body and does him the honor of burying him and so on. That could be interesting. But another possibility is the reason he's called a rich man, I think, and he isn't in all of the Gospels, but he does see to the burial of Jesus in one way or another in all of them. Why is he a rich man? I think it's an echo of like the backstory that was implied but not explained, because it's very much like the at least four ancient novels from the Greco-Roman period, where a woman is she lapses into a coma. They think she's dead. She is entombed. She's an aristocrat, and she's entombed in this mausoleum with all kinds of funerary tokens and cloth of gold, this and that, and a bunch of tomb robbers say, "Hey, look, that rich person's tomb. It's closed now. Tonight, what say we get out the crowbars and open it up and steal all the goodies? They got no use for them." So they do this, but just at that moment, the woman starts to wake up from the coma, and they say, "Oh my God, what are we going to do now?" And they decide, "Hey, let's kidnap her and sell her as a slave somewhere." And sure enough, the next morning, her fiance comes to mourn at the tomb. Turns out the tomb is empty. He first thinks that the gods have raptured her into heaven, envious of her beauty and all that. And then somebody reconstructs what actually happened. So what I'm getting at is, if Joseph buried Jesus in his own tomb, and it was an opulent tomb, as it would have been because it was carved out of the side and of the hill or whatever, and he's a rich man, that would have provided the motivation for somebody to break into the tomb, only to find, to their surprise, that Jesus is coming out of it, and then release him. I think that's what's going on, and that's why he's called a rich man. So there may be a lot more backstory.
What about the other interesting found? I mean, again, Isaiah is a key for lots of things. There's a lot of reverse engineering happens to connect to Isaiah, and you got, I think, from memory, Isaiah 53:9 that talks about the suffering man will be, or the suffering servant will be with a rich man.
Yeah, they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man. Well, Joseph of Arimathea is certainly not depicted as wicked in the Gospels. So why would they think that would apply to him? Well, the rich man, that half of it, maybe that's what suggested it to them. That well, a rich man buried him. That could come in handy. And so, yeah, I think that's probably part of the inspiration for it. Just like Psalm 22 was the skeleton upon which Mark built the crucifixion account. As to who Joseph of Arimathea was, there are a bunch of interesting theories. As a literary character, who's he based on? And Dennis MacDonald says that he thinks that a lot of stuff in the Gospels, a lot of things are based on Homer, and that Joseph asking the procurator Pilate for custody of the body to honor it by decent burial is based on King Priam of Troy daring to go up to Achilles in the Greek camp and say, "You've killed my son. You dragged his body through the streets on the hub of your chariot. Won't you let me take the body and give him a decent burial?" I mean, he knows it would be strategic for Achilles to kill him, but he's got the guts to do this. And Achilles has a moment of compassion and says, "Yeah, sure, take it." And Dennis says he thinks that is so similar to it, that's the basis of the Joseph of Arimathea story. But there's another interesting possibility. I think, like there is in the Gospels, this unease with Jesus having direct siblings or parents. And so that as in the Catholic Church, the so-called brothers of Jesus are really cousins. Yeah, that's the ticket. And that, in the empty tomb story, there's Mary, the mother of Jesus, and her sister Mary.
Mm-hmm.
Have the same name. What? And Eisenman points this out, that these things seem to be attempts to slightly rewrite the story to divorce Jesus from any human generation. And if that's the case, I wonder if Joseph of Arimathea, who already at least becomes his uncle in Christian legend, was originally supposed to be his father, Joseph. Again, Joseph is a very common name even today, but certainly in the Bible. But the idea that he's at least said to be his uncle later, it just makes me think maybe they developed the virgin birth thing. Oh, Jesus couldn't have had a human father, so who's this guy? Maybe his uncle. And he took him on vacation to Britain, right? That's another.
Yeah, that's the British connection.
So who knows? I mean, it's hard to say. And the Gospels, it's interesting that in Mark, it implies that Joseph voted to execute Jesus because he's in the Sanhedrin. It says they all voted to condemn him. But then Matthew, I think Luke says, but Joseph didn't vote for that. He's just adding that gratuitously to Mark. And then Matthew says, not only was he not in favor of it, but he was a secret disciple of Jesus. And then in John, he's a buddy and co-conspirator of Nicodemus, who was another secret Jesus believer. So you can see the growth of the tradition of Joseph of Arimathea.
But you know what? Dr. Price, it's a bit, I can understand the coherence of it, because exactly like Judas Iscariot. People haven't sinned against Jesus. They are helping Jesus to fulfill his destiny. He must be crucified. So he's not really acting in an evil way. If he's a secret and he voted for his crucifixion, maybe he doesn't want to go against the will of God, which is, it must happen. So he's actually, he's a good man. His relationship with Nicodemus is quite interesting. They're kind of linked. They work together in different gospels, and obviously that's quite even more apparent in the Gospel of Nicodemus. So it's a lot more narration sitting there. He's actually get a speaking role rather than a person just sitting in the background. He's actually talking, and people were actually arguing with him, and he's explaining why have they sinned, because they just crucified Jesus, but they speared him onto his side, and he gets a few lines, in that act. Mm-hmm. So, what is that relationship between Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea?
Well, I think that I don't think there was a Nicodemus. Some Jews were named that. It's a Greek name, but that's not a surprise given the Hellenization of the whole area. But it's very rare among Jews in terms of ancient attestation. We know of one other one, Nakdimon, which is just a different transliteration of it. But I think it's Nicodemus is I think a fictional character because for one thing, his name says he's Nicodemus, a ruler of the people, which means he's in the Sanhedrin. Well, Nicodemus happens to mean ruler of the people. So is he another narrative man? He's named for the sole function he plays. And as I think Raymond Brown is right about this, he says that Nicodemus is in there as a kind of an object lesson because he represents Jews who are high placed, but have come to believe Jesus is the Messiah, but they know what's going to happen if they let this be known, because John presupposes the 18 benedictions thing, when they added the curse on the Nazarenes in the synagogue, so that if you were one, you wouldn't call down God's curse on yourself. So I guess it's time for me to quit. Well, this is in the wake of it. It even mentions that later. The time is coming when they'll kick you out of the synagogues, etc. Well, Nicodemus, it says, look, we know you're a teacher sent from God, or you'd never be able to do these miracles. And then Jesus says to him out of nowhere, unless one is born anew, he cannot see the kingdom of God. And he says, unless one is born from above, or again, same word in Greek, unless he is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. Doesn't he have to mean Christian baptism? That would be the public declaration that, yeah, I'm a Jesus freak. Okay, well, you know where you can go, Nicodemus. You're fired. And this was a problem. And so that John is saying, if you hope to be saved, you got to make it public. Stand up for Jesus. You can't, or this is the issue. And it says, if anyone in this sinful and adulterous generation is ashamed of me and my words, you won't admit you're a Christian, well, there's going to be hell to pay when the Son of Man returns. And so that was a big deal. Or Peter, right? Jesus who? Never heard of him. It's no. You're buying yourself a one-way ticket to the inferno. You must confess your faith. And the big way of doing that is baptism. And you are born again in the Spirit and all that stuff. So was there actually a Nicodemus? Well, it doesn't really matter, but there were people like him. There were people in his position, and that's the point that John is making.
Yeah. So he represents the idea. And I can understand that. But it's very interesting to you talked about the Britain situation, because there's that silly story that somehow connected the spread of Christianity in Britain to Joseph of Arimathea. Can you tell us a little bit about this ridiculous narrative?
Yeah, the reason for that was that it was an attempt to say, look, we're not under Celtic Christianity. We're not under the thumb of the Pope of Rome. We have a different Christian founder. Joseph of Arimathea brought the gospel to Britain long before your guy did. So we don't need you, and we're not under your authority. So that appears to have been the point, a kind of an alternate foundation legend, a kind of Protestant indifference to the pre-Protestant, of course, it's older, but it was the same idea. We don't have any fealty to you. We got our own thing going here.
Another interesting story, and this is a crazy one, but the Holy Grail, and I think it's down your alley because you're interested in stuff like that, like me. Because after he was captured, apparently that's what sustained him miraculously. It had the Holy Grail is claimed to have some sort of magical powers. What can you tell us about that?
Well, that's because ultimately the Grail is, though it's sort of masked as the chalice of the Last Supper, but it originally appears to have been a Christianized version of the horn of plenty of Bran the Blessed, who was kind of an ancient Celtic champion, a demigod, whatever, so that there was an endless supply of food. And so that there's a great book by somebody or other, Loomis, about from Celtic something to Christian symbol, I forget, but it's a really good critical treatment of all of that. But that's what it seems to have been. And this idea where Percival is in the castle of the Fisher King, and he sees somebody the king doesn't appear for dinner because he's in his apartments. He's got some kind of awful wasting disease, just as the land does. And so his servant brings the cup and the supper to him. And if Percival asks, whom does one serve with the Grail? Who is being serve dinner, including this, he would have gained the Grail and regenerated the countryside, but it didn't occur to him. And later he's told, and he does manage to go back and ask the question, and I guess the Fisher King drinks from it. And like in Excalibur, one of my favorite movies, you and the land are one. Drink from the chalice and you shall be renewed. It's great. So it becomes the saving chalice of the blood of Christ. And I believe the story went that that when Joseph was imprisoned, which is kind of a surprise given the fact that he was on good terms with Pilate in the Gospels, but he is thrown into the slammer, and he's and Jesus, after his resurrection, appears to him and gives him the Grail and says, I want you to take this up north. And so he goes first to Brittany, I think, and builds a table for the Grail. And some unknown to me time later, it's moved to, I guess, must have been Joseph who moved it to Glastonbury, England, where they built the first table of the Grail was the table of the Last Supper. The second one was the one in Brittany, I guess it was. The third one is the round table of Arthur and his knights, and they have to go find the Grail to restore it to its proper place. And that's so the whole thing is everybody hates Ralph Ellis because he ties Jesus in with King Arthur and all. I've not read that book yet, so I'm not quite sure what he means by it. But I think if you want to understand the Arthurian thing, you have to realize it's a continuation of the Gospels. And it's great. It's magnificent. Is it historical? Well, is anything in the whole thing historical?
Yeah. Another ridiculous story about the Glastonbury thorn, where his staff turned into a blossoming a tree or whatever.
Right.
It's another incredible. In your opinion, you would think miracles will only be attributed to Jesus being the Lord, not his stuff. Like if his stuff has magical powers, like his chalice, it kind of begs the question: where's the source of the divine energy comes from? It should come from the divine, but does it extend to his stuff and to whoever he touches? Just like the movie The Green Mile, by the Jesus incarnate touching the mouse and bring it back to life. The mouse gets an everlasting life, but I think it's probably symbolic. The symbolic of you will have everlasting life, as in within Jesus. But if Joseph of Arimathea cared for the Lord in his death, does he get then these kind of miracles as a thank you very much? You have been a wonderful servant.
Could be, but it could just be trying to make him look like Moses, who had the miracle working staff.
Yeah.
And that has the backstory in medieval Christian legend that when Adam, over 900 years old, is finally on his deathbed, Eve and Seth are there with him, and one of them says, Eve sends Seth back to the Garden of Eden, and he asks the cherub guarding the tree of life with a flaming sword, could you give me fruit or a branch or something from the tree of life to give to Adam? Have mercy. And he says, well, I cannot do that. God has forbidden that, but here's what I will do. Here, take this branch. And it turns out to become the magical wand of King Solomon, who was in the ancient world esteemed a great exorcist and magician. And before that, it was the staff of Moses. And eventually it became part of the cross. I wonder if, I forget some of the details, but it seems possible that they thought the staff of Joseph of Arimathea was the same thing. I'll have to look that up and see.
Yeah, very interesting. we kind of we want to draw this to conclusion, and I want to summarize the conversation here. But I want to also allude to a couple of things. I'm a historicist. However, I can now I'm getting close to understanding the dilemma, the conversation between mythicists and historicists. There is no denying that the gospel and the story narrative is full of myth. It's made up characters that probably never existed and only serve as an idea, or they resemble a group of people put together in just the one person, or a concept. And there are a couple of real things happening in the background, and it becomes very difficult to separate the two at some point. In your opinion, of the two characters we talked about today, which one is historical to you, or close to being historical?
I would think that John the Baptist has a greater, the probabilities are greater that even though the stories connecting him with Jesus may be spurious, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, there's nothing particularly implausible about such a character existing. And it's pretty easy to separate John the Baptist, the apocalyptic preacher and head of a sect, from all this stuff predicted.
Because it's very convoluted. You could be talking about two historical characters, possibly Jesus and John the Baptist, but the narrative between them is a myth. It's never happened.
That's what I think. Yeah.
They've connected them somehow.
Mm-hmm. Well, a great example of that would be that in Matthew, John knows who Jesus is as soon as Jesus shows up. In John, he discovers that Jesus is the elect one once he sees him. They're kind of alike. In Luke, it doesn't say, I mean, it says they were cousins as infants, but we don't hear that they remained in contact. Maybe they did, but it doesn't say anything about John recognizing Jesus at the baptism, though he baptizes him. And in Mark, same thing. He's just there when everybody else is getting baptized. Well, now, so you got in Matthew and Luke, a recognition on the spot. In Mark, I'm sorry, what is that? Matthew and John. That's right. So in Mark and Luke, you have Jesus get baptized, but there's no hint that John knows him from Adam. Well, in the Q material that appears in both Luke and Matthew, we have a scene where John in prison hears of the miracles Jesus is doing and calls his disciples and said, go ask this guy, is he the coming one I was sent to preach about? And then they go and they say, John wants to know this. And he says, well, you tell him what you're seeing here. And blessed is he who's not offended at me. And they go back. We don't ever hear what John's reaction was. And I think that's because it's open-ended and aimed at the reader. Well, who do you think he was? Mm-hmm. And, but the thing is, how, if Jesus had been publicly endorsed by John as the Messiah, how come it's only now dawning on him that Jesus might be the Messiah? Now, usually they harmonize this in the lamest fashion by saying, well, John was pretty much bummed out if Jesus was really what he thought he was. Then what's he doing in this jail cell with the rats and the no cable TV and stuff like that? What the heck? But it says when he hears of the miracles that Jesus is doing, that's going to prompt him to wonder, maybe I was wrong about this guy. No, obviously, the story by itself said John began to put two and two together and said, maybe this guy's the Messiah. But later Christians said, no, that's not good enough. He must have endorsed him. And poor Matthew just didn't notice that the two items contradicted one another. So that's a great example of how the connection is fictional.
Yeah. So the two stories could have happened separately, and the Christians have used the narrative as an endorsement later on. This is John the Baptist. He's been talking about the coming Messiah and the baptizing of the coming Messiah for years. And here comes Jesus, and voila, the prophecy is fulfilled, and the two are connected. So it is quite interesting. It is very possible. Joseph of Arimathea, however, we kind of agree that he is no one. He is just there to serve a certain purpose within the gospel. It could have been anyone. Anybody would have done the trick, but he isn't. He's not mentioned anywhere. Was he mentioned at all at any stage prior to that incident?
No, Nicodemus is in a prior scene in John,
Yeah.
but that's I'm pretty sure Joseph of Arimathea is not.
Yeah, same here. All my readings is he's only appears on the scene suddenly, and then the secret disciple. He was always there, but he just lurking in the background, waiting for the moment so he can give him that tomb that will make everything else possible. The two angels sitting there, and the stones are moved, and Jesus is no longer there. It had to be. It couldn't be just a hole in the ground. It needed to be a proper tomb, and that proper tomb can only come from a rich person. The rich person had to exist for that to happen, and then you connect it to the Isaiah, and voila, everything is coherent. So a lot of reverse engineering happening here.
Yeah, I like that. I use that metaphor too. Often you can kind of see how it evolved backwards that way. Fascinating.
It is fascinating, and it just shows you the human imagination and what kind of narrative it can create. However, so I'm in agreement with you. I think if one, I would have to lean towards John the Baptist. I think Joseph of Arimathea is completely manufactured and fabricated. But that's what makes and I want your final comments on that before we close. The mythicist position, it's widely misunderstood as a dogma. For some reason, lots of people, like if you're a historicist, and I've got to know the two narratives now, and I've got to understand, like you and Richard Carrier and all the reasonable mythicists that were not crackpots, who would say, I'm talking about plausibility here. I don't know for sure. I wasn't there. But it looks like there is so many legends and myths that it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck. Maybe it's a duck. But you're not quite sure, are you?
That's right. I mean, there's no way to know because too many aspects of it could be mythical, but they could be legendary embellishments. That happens. Like one example, like you could imagine a historical Jesus who functioned as a faith healer and an exorcist, because there are people like that today. I mean, I don't know if there's any supernatural involved or it's just aberrant psychology, but there are people that do this. And Bultmann said, Jesus must have understood himself to be a healer and so forth, whatever we may think of it. Well, okay. But in the Gospels, it has Jesus healing everybody in big crowds wherever he goes, with no hint that any of them that it failed. There is one, right? The I see men as trees walking thing, but I think that's a paradigm for Christian healers trying to do this. And don't worry if you don't succeed at first. Keep trying. But on the whole, the picture is he's like Superman. again, that he can do anything on the spot. And I first thought of this when I was reading Edward Zeller's commentary on the Book of Acts, where he says Peter, when Dorcas or Tabitha dies, and Peter's in the neighborhood, so they call him to come and raise him from the dead, and he does. It's like it's Marcus Welby making a house call. I mean, you can be sure this guy's like, we got rats, let's get the fumigator in here. You mean that these guys were superheroes who could just do any miracle that was needed? You're not dealing with any known reality there.
Yeah, I completely agree. Well, Dr. Price, once again, thank you so much. The amount of information displayed today is very much appreciated. I think you portrayed a very vivid pictures of both interesting characters we talked about today. I think next I wanna cover Josephus, not for the same reason. I think Josephus is a very interesting one to talk about, because he's allegedly that sort of neutral source of attestation. Was he actually neutral? I want to get into it. Why did he change his name, and why he became sort of into the Hellenistic sort of culture, and what happened there to his not conversion, but his attraction to the empire, and was he paid to do a job? I want to know that, and I think that will make an interesting conversation. But would you like to say any last words on today's topic at all before we conclude?
Well, yeah, one thing you mentioned, it's so easy to imagine making up stories about these characters. You ain't kidding. I wrote a story some years ago called, what the heck was it now? It was a Rush lyric. Oh my God, I've forgotten. But it purports to be the testament of Joseph of Arimathea, explaining how the whole thing happened, and that he was one of the 50 righteous of Jewish legend, and that they were all magicians of some kind, and that they're supposed to be keeping the earth going by increasing righteousness among its people, but things are really going down the drain, and so they decide to pool their powers and create the golem, and that is Jesus. They create him to use their power to help. And then it's interesting to see what happens and all that. So that was published in a book called The Dead Walk. I can't think. Oh, yeah. The story is called The Righteous Rise. And so I think it's in my book, Horrors and Heresies.
Interesting. So Jesus as a repository of accumulated energy being put into the one by the Guardians of the Galaxy.
Yeah.
Wow, that is fascinating. It's brilliant, but it shows. I mean, that could be the gospel according to Joseph of Arimathea.
Yeah, that's basically what it was, and I do it with a straight face. I say, well, I'm a fellow of the Jesus Seminar, and as such, I'm in touch with various scholars, and that John Allegro, who wrote The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross and stuff like that, he's really like out there, and nobody gives him any credit because he was so controversial. And well, it turned out that he left this translated piece that he never sought publication for because he knew he would be savaged. Well, his estate was familiar with my crazy work and said, "Do you want to do anything with this?" And I said, "Well, here it is." And so it's all done with a straight face. And I read it to anybody who wanted to hear it at the Jesus Seminar once. And it went over pretty well. So it's great fabricating your own scriptures.
I mean, that's another topic for another episode I want to have with you. So were you part of the Jesus Seminar?
Oh yeah, yeah, for a few years.
I want to talk about that again. I mean,
Oh
that
yeah.
is fascinating. How many were you? Couple of hundred or less than that?
There are about 75 participating scholars, and I'd say 40 to 50 of them show up to each of the semi-annual meetings
Right,
and
right.
questions. They're a great bunch of people. I lost interest in it when it started to get into what the stuff that bored me, like the economy of ancient Galilee and what relevance that might have. And forget it. And
Yeah.
then what really broke the camel's back was when Donald Trump was elected, and these guys, all being liberals, said, "Oh, the Jesus Seminar now has to be devoted to opposing Trumpism." I said,
Oh, that's ridiculous. This
"The
is when
media."
I mean, I'm not Trump fan, but I've got to call a spade a spade. Things like that annoys me because that it's not its function, and
Yeah,
it becomes it's a different conversation. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, that's why everything gets sort of diluted nowadays, and everything is mixed, and nobody can focus on anything because you can turn up to let's save the whales on Earth, and then suddenly bash somebody because you don't like their haircut, and I'm not a big fan. It
yeah.
just gets diluted. Thank you again. Fantastic conversation,
Oh
and
yeah,
I'll be in touch. Well, the New Year's in a couple of days' time, so it's upon us, and I'll be in touch to have the next two conversations will be the Jesus Seminar and Josephus. And
okay.
thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you very much. All right, folks. Thank you very much for tuning in today. I will be having a break for a week or so, and I will be back after the first week of January. Thanks very much.